Most of us never had a money conversation with our fathers. Not a real one. Not the kind where someone sits down and explains how a mortgage works, or what happens when you spend money you don't have, or why the neighbor's new car means less than it appears to. And yet somehow, the men who raised us held everything together. One income, paid off houses, a savings account nobody touched, debt that got smaller every year instead of larger. They taught us. We just didn't know we were being taught. My father never sat me down for a money lesson, not once in 18 years. What he did instead, what most fathers of his generation did instead, was something I didn't understand until I was 43 years old, standing in a garage in Akron, staring at a car I was about to buy on credit. There are 12 things he taught me without ever saying them out loud. The 12th one changes how you hear all the others. We'll get there. Akron, Ohio, 1961. Thomas Riley worked the second shift at the Goodyear plant and came home at 11:30 every night, smelling of rubber and machine oil. He made $94 a week. He owned his house outright. He drove a used car he'd paid for in cash. He owed no one anything. He never explained how this was possible. That wasn't how it worked in houses like his. You didn't explain money. You lived it every day in the ordinary decisions and the ordinary refusals, and if the people around you were paying attention, they absorbed something they couldn't name until decades later. My father was a version of Thomas Riley. So was yours, most likely, or your grandfather. The man who clocked in and clocked out, and somehow, on what the paper said was not enough, built something that held. Here is what he taught, without ever sitting down to teach it. The first thing Thomas Riley taught me was what a handshake actually meant. He shook hands the way other men signed contracts, slowly, with eye contact, with the particular gravity of someone who understood that his word was the contract, and the handshake was just the moment it became official. He told me once, one of the only times he spoke directly about money, that a man's reputation was worth more than his credit score because you couldn't dispute your reputation with a letter to an agency. You either had it or you didn't, and the men who knew you knew which. What this meant in practice, he paid what he owed, on time, to the dollar, not because he feared consequences, but because his name was attached to the obligation, and his name meant something he had spent 20 years building. The neighbor who borrowed $40 and took 3 months to pay it back had, in Thomas's view, spent those 3 months paying for something much more expensive than $40, something you couldn't get back with interest. The second thing he taught me happened every Saturday morning before breakfast, without discussion, without announcement. Thomas walked to the garage, oil level, tire pressure, battery terminals, 10 minutes, same order, same result, a car that kept running. The car was a 1957 Chevrolet. He bought it used in 1959 for $780 cash and drove it until 1971, 12 years, 0 car payments. The Saturday ritual was the reason. A problem found on Saturday costs $2. The same problem ignored until Thursday costs $200. He had watched men at the plant buy new cars every 3 years because they hadn't maintained the one they had, and he considered this a specific kind of financial failure, not of income, but of attention. He never said this. He just walked to the garage on Saturday mornings. And I watched. And 12 years later, when I had my own car, I walked to the garage on Saturday mornings without thinking about why. The third thing was the lunch pail. Same lunch, 23 years, sandwich, apple, thermos of coffee packed the night before. The men on his shift bought from the canteen, $1.10 a day, plus the coffee. Over a year, that was $280. Over 10 years, more. Thomas spent roughly $14 a year on the same items made at home. He didn't do this because he was frugal by temperament. He did it because somewhere early in his working life, he had decided that the dollar spent at the canteen was a dollar not going toward the mortgage. And the mortgage had a specific number on it, a countdown. The canteen had no countdown. The choice, once you understood it that way, was not difficult. And here is what none of us understood watching our fathers do these things. What became clear to me only much later is that none of it was accidental. Every decision connected to every other decision. But there's one rule that makes this visible. Rule 7 is where it becomes clear, and it reframes everything that comes before it. The fourth thing Thomas taught me, without meaning to teach it, was what "we'll see" actually means. When I asked for something expensive, a bicycle, a new glove, the thing my friend had, he said 2 words, "We'll see," not yes, not no. 2 weeks later, I had usually stopped wanting it. He had noticed. What I didn't understand then was that We'll See was a diagnostic tool, not a delay. He was testing whether the desire was real or temporary. A desire that survived 2 weeks of ordinary life was worth considering. One that faded on its own had solved itself without costing anything. He applied this to his own spending too. Things that appeared on the kitchen counter stayed there for days before any decision was made. The counter was the waiting period. The waiting period was the filter. Today, the average American makes a significant unplanned purchase within minutes of first seeing it. Thomas Riley's filter was a kitchen counter and 2 weeks. Over 30 years, the savings were not small. The fifth thing was the Sunday newspaper. Not the sports section, not the comics. Every Sunday morning, Thomas read the financial pages. He had no market investments, just the savings account, the pension, and the house. But he read them every week for 30 years because he believed, and said this exactly once when I asked, that a man who doesn't understand how money moves is a man other people can take advantage of. This is the part that gets overlooked. Financial literacy for his generation wasn't about optimizing returns. It was about defense. Understanding enough to recognize when someone was trying to separate you from yours, the banker explaining the home equity loan, the salesman making installment credit sound like opportunity, the advertisement making debt look like convenience. Thomas read the financial pages the way you check the weather before leaving the house, not because he could control it, because he wanted to know what he was walking into. The sixth thing, the overtime envelope. When the plant offered Saturday shifts, Thomas took them. Not every week, but 4 or 5 times a year. The Saturday pay, roughly $47 after tax, never entered the household budget. It went directly into a separate envelope my mother kept in the back of the kitchen drawer, thicker paper, labeled in pencil with one word, extra. Not the grocery envelope, not utilities, extra. It was the reserve behind the reserve. It sat untouched until the furnace failed in February 1963, and the roof lost 2 shingles in 1966, and my sister's community college tuition arrived in 1968. Thomas never explained the envelope. He put the overtime check in it and went back to his Saturday. Today, the average American household has less than $1,000 in liquid savings. Thomas Riley, on $94 a week with 4 children and a mortgage, kept 7 months of reserves in an envelope in the back of a kitchen drawer. The seventh thing is the one I've been building toward. Thomas Riley never explained his financial decisions to anyone outside the house, not once. The neighbors knew he drove a used car. They knew he brought his lunch. They knew he didn't have the new television set that appeared in every other living room by 1956. He knew they knew. He said nothing. When I asked him about this once, years later, he said something I've thought about every week since. A man who explains his money to his neighbors has already lost something. He wasn't sure what to call it. He called it standing. What he meant, I think, is this. The moment you start defending your financial choices to people who don't pay your bills, you've accepted their judgment as relevant. You've granted authority they haven't earned. Thomas didn't grant that authority to anyone. He lived inside a clear set of principles. He knew why he was doing what he was doing, and other people's opinions of his used car were genuinely none of his concern. The advertising industry has spent 70 years dismantling exactly this. Thomas held it without effort. Most of us fight for it every day. The eighth thing he taught me was about repair. Thomas never threw away something that still worked. The Chevrolet ran until 1971. The kitchen radio was repaired twice by a man on 5th Street who charged $3 a visit. His work boots were resold 3 times before he bought new ones. His winter coat lasted 17 years. This wasn't poverty. By 1965, he was earning $112 a week, enough to replace these things easily. He didn't replace them because they worked. The thing about this principle is that it's not really about the coat. It's about the relationship between a person and what they own. Thomas owned things completely. He repaired them, used them until they were genuinely finished, and replaced them only when nothing else was possible. He was not managed by the desire for newer things. He managed the things he had. And now we're at Rule 9, the only time my father ever spoke about money directly. I was 19 years old, summer of 1969. I had just started my first full-time job at the parts distributor on Route 18, making $82 a week, and I felt, for the first time in my life, like I had actual money, real wages arriving every Friday in an envelope with my name on it. My father came into the kitchen on a Sunday morning while I was reading the paper. He sat down across from me. He didn't say anything for a moment, Then he said 3 things. First, pay what you owe before you spend what's left. Second, never borrow for anything that goes down in value. Third, the amount in the savings account isn't the number that matters. The number that matters is how many months you can go without the paycheck. Then he got up and went back to the garage. That was it. 18 years of watching. 3 sentences. I have thought about those sentences nearly every week for 50 years. Not because they're complicated, because they're not. Because everything I had watched him do for 18 years was, in 3 sentences, finally explained. The lunch pail was principle 1. The 1957 Chevrolet was principle 2. The extra envelope in the back of the kitchen drawer was principle 3. He didn't sit me down at 12 and explain his philosophy. He lived it for 18 years. Then, at the exact moment I was ready to hear it, he said 3 sentences and walked back to the garage. I didn't understand at 19 that this was a gift. The last 3 rules are the ones nobody mentions. They're the ones that held everything else in place. The 10th thing was what he did in 1968 when the first Bank AmeriCard arrived in the mail. He opened the envelope. He looked at the card for approximately 4 seconds. He cut it in half with the kitchen scissors, put both pieces back in the envelope, sealed it, and mailed it back. I watched this happen. He said nothing. He didn't need to. I had been watching him operate for 15 years, and I already knew why. If the money wasn't in his pocket, he didn't spend it. A card that let you spend money that wasn't in your pocket was a mechanism for spending money you hadn't yet earned. The credit card companies would spend the next 30 years explaining why this was the wrong way to think about it. Thomas Riley cut the card in half and mailed it back. The 11th thing was how he made decisions. Thomas never made a significant financial choice in conversation. If someone asked him something involving money, a commitment, a purchase, a question about what he could or couldn't afford, he said, "I'll let you know." And then he thought about it alone, for however long it took. He did not think out loud. He did not ask for opinions. He gathered information, went quiet, and arrived at a decision that was entirely his. This is rarer than it sounds. Most financial mistakes happen in conversation, in the showroom, at the kitchen table with the salesman, in the moment when social pressure overrides the discipline to wait. Thomas removed himself from those conversations before they could cost him anything. The 12th thing is the one that ties everything else together. And it was the thing I noticed only after I had my own household and my own dinner table to compare it to. My father never talked about money at dinner, not because it was forbidden, not because the numbers were bad, because there was nothing pressing to discuss. The mortgage went out on the 1st, the utilities were covered, the extra envelope had what it needed. The savings account was growing at its usual pace. The silence was the signal. The households where money gets discussed constantly are the households where money gets worried about constantly. The household where money is quiet is the household where money is managed. Thomas's dinner table was quiet because Thomas's finances were in order. The silence wasn't avoidance. It was the sound of someone who had done the work. And then something changed. Not suddenly, but the way things usually change when they matter. Gradually, and then completely. The credit card arrived. Then the home equity loan became a mainstream product marketed to people who had just finished paying off their houses. Then the television began telling people that debt was leverage and spending was self-expression, and a new car every 3 years was the standard American life. The generation that came after Thomas Riley's, my generation, and then the one after mine, grew up without the lunch pail and the Saturday garage and the extra envelope in the back of the kitchen drawer. They grew up without the 3 sentences. And the difference, measured in household balance sheets across 50 years, has been enormous. Akron, Ohio. 2026. The Goodyear plant still operates with a fraction of the workforce. The house on Barber Road sold in 1989. The 1957 Chevrolet is someone's restoration project or scrap metal. Thomas Riley died in 1991. Paid off house, savings account with 14 months of expenses, no debt. He had made at his peak $127 a week. He raised 4 children and never explained himself to anyone. He taught me 12 things without ever sitting me down to teach them. I understood most of them too late to have made better use of them at 19. But I understood them. And now you've heard them. The dollar your grandfather earned bought something more than groceries. It bought time. It bought quiet. It bought the kind of sleep that comes when nothing is owed to anyone. Thomas Riley slept well, in a house that was his, for 41 years. The lunch pail is gone. The overtime envelope is gone. The Chevrolet is gone. The three sentences are still there. Pay what you owe before you spend what's left. Never borrow for anything that goes down in value. The number that matters is how many months you can go without the paycheck. He said them once. Once was enough. Next week, we're looking at the savings passbook, the small booklet every American household kept in a kitchen drawer, where every deposit was hand-stamped by a teller and the number grew one line at a time. The day it disappeared, something about how Americans relate to saving disappeared with it. If you want to be there when it drops, you know what to do.